Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We have a return guest today. It's a topic I am fascinated by, which I'm hoping to get. People should probably bring out their nerd bingo cards early, just to be forewarned. But because this is like very on brand Remnant stuff we're going to get into. But today's guest is Ryan Bourne, who, according to his Cato bio, he's at the Cato Institute, occupies the R. Evan Scharf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at the Cato Institute. He's the author of the recent book, Economics in One Lesson, but he's also the editor of a very exciting book just out called The War on Prices: How Popular Misconceptions About Inflation, Prices, and Value Create Bad Policy. And it's full of like a gazillion essays from some of my favorite people on just everything you ever wanted to argue about: prices, inflation, COVID, all of this kind of stuff. I'll run through some of the chapter titles later. But first, Ryan, welcome back to the Remnant.
Great to be with you, Jonah. I just do want to correct one thing, though. I'm not the author of Economics in One Lesson. I don't want to take that away from Henry Hazlitt. Yeah, I'm the author of Economics in One Virus, a very different book.
I'm sorry. Economics in One Lesson looms so large in my life that it just came out because But yes, it's Economics in One Virus. I was literally reading it, but my love for Henry Hazlitt just made me say that. I apologize to everybody. And of course, while you're a libertarian, that doesn't mean you aren't wildly committed to property rights. And Henry Hazlitt owns that title. So there we go. Welcome to the Remnant, sir. Great to have you here.
Great to be with you.
So there's a lot of wonky, practical, close to the ground, empirical stuff in this book, which is really a lot of fun. But I want to start sort of big picture. As you know, you're one of the few people out there who knows this well. The definition of a price is something that is actually kind of debated, right? Like what prices are. I mean, I think everybody agrees with it directionally and generally, but there are a bunch of different definitions out there, and there are a bunch of different ways to think about prices. So, like metaphorically, like how do you consider prices a signal? Do you consider them information? How do you think people should think about prices?
Pretty much all of the above. I think the key point of this book is to try and distinguish between kind of market prices and inflation, the price level. Now, the price level is a macroeconomic phenomenon. Inflation is really caused by an imbalance between the amount of money in the economy at any given time and the amount of goods and services, real output being produced. But I think the way to think about prices, really market prices at least, is that they're a bottom-up phenomenon reflecting the supply and demand factors, forces that are occurring in a market at any given time. And as a result of reflecting, the supply and demand forces, their movements, their absolute value provide us with vital information from which to base our economic decisions. So I really like Alex Tabarrok's definition. He says a price is a kind of signal wrapped in an incentive. And I think that really gets to the heart of the beauty of prices, really. They do signal kind of the relative scarcities of products at any given time, but their movements provide us with an incentive to change our behavior based on when that relative scarcity changes. So I know that's very wonkish. So I'll provide one example. The beauty of prices when it comes to, say, the baby formula crisis that we had a couple of years ago. If we were a planner trying to plan out the economy, we'd need to know, okay, that baby formula factory has been closed down as a result of breaching some FDA regulations or whatever. We need to allocate resources in a different way such that people can still get their baby formula who really need it. Prices kind of aggregate that information. It means you don't need to collect that information. You don't need that knowledge. All I need to know when I'm a consumer of baby formula is I walk into the store and see that the price is higher, and I think, this is probably not a great time to load up and buy as much as, buy 3 months worth of the stuff as I needed. Perhaps I'll leave a bit by, and that ensures that people who put the highest value on baby formula at any given time can get more of it. So it's kind of all of what you described above, and
Right.
And that's why it's so crucial to coordinating economic activity.
Right. I mean, one of the reasons I bring it up is just because, Hayek's knowledge problem is one of the grand themes of this podcast. And part of his whole point is that, and he talks about prices in a lot of different places, but, the core point of the knowledge problem thing is, you take a price of a loaf of bread, the variables that go into that are, once you start thinking it through and sort of writing them down, it's the price of wheat, but what goes into the price of wheat? Well, it goes into the weather last year. It goes into the substitution effect for other crops that can be used instead of wheat. It goes into how good the crops were in other places that produce wheat. It has to do with the price of gasoline that brings the wheat to market. It has to do with the price of insurance, having to do with, all sorts of externalities. And you got to start going through a list. And so Hayek's problem, he doesn't talk about bread, but he talks about how experts can't know in Washington in real time, right, in usable time, all of those variables. But what they can know is the price of things, and that gives them information where they don't have to open up the lid and say, well, why is the price of this high? Because it may not even be knowable. And that, once you start thinking about what prices are, it's more than just the amount, like the standard economics definition from the old days was just the amount of money required to purchase a good or service, right? But like that really doesn't get into just how rich a concept pricing is. And I think that's one of the political problems which you deal with a lot in the book is like, because people don't understand the role of prices. They just say, well, why can't you just say the prices shouldn't get higher, right? Why can't you just cap the amount it costs to rent a house or rent an apartment or buy baby formula because that's the right thing to do? And it turns out that's the kind of thing you say when you don't actually understand the full function of prices in a free economy.
Yeah, and as you say, it captures a lot of tacit. That price reflects a lot of information that's essentially tacit knowledge, is what you were referring to. So, what is the best way of managing a group of insurance people who work in the insurance industry so that they're as productive as possible? Nobody would know that inherently, but that's kind of reflected in the price of insurance. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the biggest. This is all quite unintuitive, and I think one of the biggest factors that drives a lot of these misconceptions about prices is that rather than seeing them as this bottom-up result of supply, all of these supply and demand factors interacting, we tend to think of prices as being set by some sort of malevolent actors or individual actors in the economy, whether that be a business, a landlord, or somebody else. And as such, we see prices really as kind of barriers to our ambitions rather than a reflection of reality. One analogy that I use for it is prices are in effect, when we see them at least, they're in effect messengers of relative scarcity. And basically what we do when we demand governments control prices is we're really asking them to hold a gun to the messenger's head and get that messenger to tell us a comforting lie about the truth of our situation.
Yeah, so let's start. A big part of the book running through is inflation. As as they would say in Zoolander, inflation is so hot right now. Friend of the podcast, Dave Bonson's been on here many times to argue about inflation. I try really hard not to argue about inflation because there's so much math. But what is your theory of the case about where the inflation of the last few years came from and why it's so enduring?
So I think one of the reasons that there's so much debate around this is that at various different times, there's been both supply and demand factors that have driven inflation. So what do I mean by that? Well, supply factors, there were clearly issues coming out of the pandemic where certain industries were kind of struggling with supply chain woes, and struggling to find workers and the like. We then had the war in Ukraine, which obviously elevated the international gas price, which can feed through in the very short term to a spike in the price level because it makes it more expensive to produce lots of goods and services in the economy. But at the same time, we've had $6 trillion expansion in the money supply in 1.5 to 2 years at the start of the pandemic. At the same time that the federal government was borrowing trillions and trillions of dollars and shoveling them out in COVID relief programs. Now, we can look at individual periods and say how much of that was due to demand and how much of that is due to supply. But I think when you look at over the period as a whole, so you look over the past 4 years, it's pretty obvious that the enduring increase in the price level that we've seen is almost entirely or overwhelmingly a result of excess demand in the economy driven by too much stimulus from Washington, D.C. And the most obvious way to look at this is to look at how far the price level, so that overall kind of consumer prices are above where we would expect them to be if inflation had been on target. So they're about 12% above where we'd expect them to be. Then if you look at total spending in the economy relative to if it had continued at the trend that we'd seen prior to the pandemic, that's currently around 11% above where we would expect it to be, depending on where. Like you can run different numbers anywhere between 9 and 11% above where we would expect it to be. So looking at those two simple figures, I think it's obvious that over the whole period, the reason why we have enduring higher prices is because we've had a huge expansion of spending in the economy. And that shows that macroeconomic policy, that's monetary and fiscal policy, was kind of too loose relative to ensuring price stability. And this really gets to the heart of why we saw so much debate around this in 2022, late 2021, early 2022. Because a lot of people pointed to those short-term pandemic and Ukraine war factors and said, well, look at what's going on. This is all due to supply chain issues. Inflation is transitory. It will go away pretty soon. And that's exactly what we'd expect if that was the case. We'd expect, those temporary supply issues to unwind. A lot of prices would have fallen back down again to where they were before. But we haven't seen that. Monetary policy accommodated, we say, those supply chain shocks. So we saw some prices permanently elevated as a result of those shocks. But then even beyond that, the federal government combined with the Federal Reserve has overseen a huge expansion of total spending that goes way beyond that which would have just accounted for that period. So I know that's very wonkish. I think the big picture answer to your question, though, is over the period as a whole, the reason why we have a permanently higher price level now than we would have expected is almost entirely due to excess spending, which is a result of failed macroeconomic policy.
Okay, so we're going to break this down for the normals out there a little bit. First of all, the classic definition, which I think comes from Milton Friedman, but it's one of those things. As Abraham Lincoln said, don't always trust quotes on the internet. Inflation is just too much money chasing too few goods, right? Which I think is good shorthand for the basic phenomena. But first of all, like when we talked about COVID, which I think the last time you were on here, we talked about COVID, and we talked about COVID generally during the COVID times. There was a tendency among many people on the left and the right to talk about the United States as if there were no other countries in the world, and that therefore our problems were unique to us, and no other country had similar problems, no other country made similar decisions one way or the other, and all that. So how much of that applies to the inflation stuff? How much of our inflation differed from the general trend among Western European, OECD, advanced countries? Were we an outlier? Were we a lagging indicator? What if there was a difference? What would you think explains the difference?
Well, there were certain countries that had much lower inflation rates. So Switzerland had much lower inflation rates. Japan had lower inflation rates for a long period of time. It's certainly true that there's been similar inflation within the EU, the Eurozone, and the UK as well. But if you break that down with the similar type of analysis to that which I've just outlined, trying to break down how much of that was due to excess spending, the situation in Europe looks very different. Mm-hmm. So Europe was hit with much larger and enduring supply shocks as a result of the Ukraine war. The price of international gas emanating from that crisis hit a bit much harder in Europe for obvious reasons because of the interconnected energy market there. So that analysis that I've just given applies less so to Europe than the United States. In Europe, you can say a lot more of the inflation that they've seen was driven by cost pressures emanating from the supply side of the economy, whereas in the United States, a lot more of the story is due to excess demand. And the UK is kind of halfway between the two. There's been some excess demand in the UK, but nowhere near the same level that we've seen here in the United States.
Okay, and so in terms of the excess demand, people want to make it sound like the stimulus spending started when Joe Biden took office, but there was a lot of stimulus spending under Donald Trump, and there was also a lot of pent up demand because of COVID, right? People just weren't spending their dollars, so they took their COVID checks and all the rest and put them in the bank, and then that's why we saw this explosion in air travel. When COVID went away, people were like, "I gotta go on vacation," because which is weird for me because like staying home is vacation for me. But anyway, so how much of that excess demand was pent up savings from COVID versus stimulus checks starting under Trump versus, because it seems to me the fire was going pretty, there was a bonfire starting up, and then Biden comes in and says, "I vow to you today to pour a lot of gasoline on this fire," right? So it's not to blame for the fire, and the fire could have gotten bad regardless, but like he did politically at the very least, he's very vulnerable to the charge he made it worse.
Yeah, so I have a slightly different take on this. So I think we would have seen high inflation driven by excess demand due to stuff that occurred before Joe Biden took office. So right. if you look at what the Federal Reserve was doing overseeing the money supply, almost the vast majority of the money supply run up actually occurred between 2020, the start of the pandemic, through early 2021, certainly the early months of the Biden administration. Right. And I think as a result of that, the big increase in total spending that we saw was kind of baked in. Monetary policy tends to operate with a lag, 12 months to 2 years. So in that sense, he was kind of it was like playing pass the parcel, and or whatever you guys call it here. And when the music stopped, he was holding the present. Mm-hmm. That said, he then passed the American Rescue Plan,
right,
which chucked fuel on the fire of a situation where there was clearly a lot of pent up demand, as you said. People had more money; they had more money to spend. He was dishing out more in the way of stimulus checks, and we knew that the economy was going to struggle for that first year at least to reopen in a way in which we could supply goods and services to the maximum capacity of the economy. So you combine all of those factors, and I think even though we would have seen high inflation, even if Joe Biden hadn't passed the American Rescue Plan, he certainly made it much worse than it needed to be. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. So also, just one last point, because I'm really trying to stay away from monetary policy. I don't know if you've noticed that, but psychology, right? I mean, there is a thing. I'm just curious how much economists can capture it or quantify it, which says, I think prices are going to go up. I need to get ahead of that by raising my prices now. Or prices are going to go up. I need to get ahead of that by buying this thing now before it's more expensive next week. Right? There's a psychological, if you yell inflation enough, there's a certain self-fulfilling prophecy to it because people organize in anticipation of inflation, and that's inflationary. But that's also a very vibe kind of argument. Like, how much credit, if any, do you put in that? And what do economists say about it?
Well, yeah, it's not just vibe. I mean, this is the whole rational expectation school, right? So,
Right.
if you expect inflation to be high, it will be high because you adjust your decisions in the ways that you've just described. But ultimately, in order to have an inflationary environment, you need more money in circulation or fewer goods and services being produced. So, that can bring forward inflation, but it can't kind of like cause long-term inflation.
Right.
If you try and raise prices higher than the amount of money in circulation would imply, you really just end up changing relative prices because people end up spending, say, more on that good and service and less of another good and service. Demand in that alternative market falls, so that price falls. So the only way that you kind of get inflation, which is a general increase in all prices across the economy, is if monetary policy supports that.
Okay, so I found out when I was going through this book, there's a great, very nuanced, almost esoteric kind of multiply interpretable essay titled "Price Controls Have Been Disastrous Throughout History," and one of the things I'm very grateful for discovering, because I already bought the book on Kindle, which was a steal at like $3, is the author of this, Eamon Butler, with another guy, Robert L. Schudinger. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They were the authors of a book called 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls, which I just love. And I wish I'd known about that book when I was writing Suicide of the West, because a big part of my argument, it's a Deirdre McCloskey argument. It's a Jerry Mueller argument. Deirdre is one of the authors for this book, for your book, is that for most of human history, people wanted something from economics that economics wasn't good at providing, right? And they wanted to deny, you go back to the ancient Greeks, just the contempt for interest was it was considered that money should not reproduce itself, that anything that was, because there's no toil involved, right, that therefore charging interest was evil, literally unvirtuous, right? And innovation, this is obviously Deirdre's big point, is that innovation was considered sinful and dangerous, a threat to the established order. And so the expectations of what economics are supposed to do were different from what economics is good at. And it took a revolution of the mind to like all of a sudden fix all of that. And I love the fact that they've been doing wage and price controls for 40 centuries. And so what do you think? I mean, like you hold a chair for the public understanding of economics. What is the fundamental error that people make, or I know what the error is. What is the motivation for it? What is the rationale, do you think, for people to say, no, but this time price controls can work, right? What is it that drives us to make that mistake for 40 centuries?
That's a great question. Actually, one of the things that Eamon notes is that the earliest instance of price controls, like 2800 BC in Egypt, was price controls on grain, and then in 2022 during the pandemic, the Egyptian government legislated the price of bread. So we kind of come full circle on that. It's a great question. I think with price controls, there's just, the main issue that I've noted, and like the thread that I think goes through all of this, is that a lot of people seem to presume that it's somehow illegitimate to raise prices when consumers' demand has gone up, as opposed to businesses' costs rising and there being a constrained supply environment. And you see this with the anti-price gouging legislation, the push for that, overwhelming public support for anti-price gouging legislation. So this idea that companies can't raise prices during emergencies, even if, demand for bottled water or hotel rooms or whatever has gone through the roof. You see it in the skepticism at the moment of dynamic pricing, this idea that, other outlets, entertainment centers, Ticketmaster, whatever, should have prices that reflect live in-play supply and demand, overseen by some sort of algorithm. But I also think you see it with the inflation as well. So I think one of the reasons why the greedflation narrative was so appealing was that people saw that there was a period in 2021, 2022, when certain businesses saw higher prices and higher profits at the same time. And rather than thinking, well, maybe a third factor was driving that, maybe it was kind of excess demand in the economy driven by too much stimulus, which was pushing up retail prices faster than wage costs, which tend to adjust more slowly over time. People saw that as a kind of moral failure, malevolence on behalf of businesses. So I guess the answer to your question really is, I think it's a failure to appreciate that demand matters as well as supply in determining prices. And I think that a lot of the time people observe a very static situation in a market and think of price controls as a form of redistribution almost, which they are, without thinking through what the second order effects of restraining prices relative to market rates will be on supply itself. So I think it's just an instinct that, demand is there, demand is fixed, we all have our needs, and businesses are a tool that should be used to reflect that. And if they're not, then the government should step in and control prices in some way.
Yeah, so Biden's big argument, Elizabeth Warren's big argument, is that corporate greed is the thing that is driving inflation. I find it wildly implausible, particularly when Elizabeth Warren talks about supermarkets, where supermarket margins, profit margins are historically 1 or 2%, and so the idea that somehow excessive profit taking is the thing that explains eggs going up, 40% in price, just seems sort of implausible. But is there? I mean, I'm not going to ask you to steel man it, but what is the best argument when you actually talk to these people away from a television camera? What is the best argument they make that corporations do play a role in inflation, if there is one?
So, I mean, the best version of their theory, which is entertained seriously by them but not by many economists, is the idea that, look, inflation had begun anyway. We saw these supply shocks, and yes, maybe there was some excess demand, but that gave companies an opportunity to effectively collude, right? So they were able to tell consumers, our costs are going up as a result of what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on with the pandemic or, the broader inflationary environment, and use that as an excuse to raise prices slightly higher than they otherwise would, to increase their markups and increase their margins. Now, the problem with that as a matter of economics is I don't think it takes either competition or consumers seriously enough. One of the reasons collusion breaks down in a free market economy is because if everybody decides to kind of up their price above the market rate, an individual firm has a huge incentive to undercut them and take as much business as possible. So this idea that all of a sudden we got collusion across a vast range of different sectors, a vast range of industries in highly competitive kind of cutthroat environments like supermarkets, as you say, is just not plausible. But the second reason it's not plausible is that ultimately somebody has to pay these higher prices. So what was it about consumers coming out of the pandemic that meant that they were willing or able to pay higher prices than they were before? Could it be the fact that the money supply had increased by 6 trillion over a 2-year period? The only way that you kind of get a general inflation whereby goods and services prices are increasing across the board is if you have that type of monetary accommodation, if you have more money in circulation that people are spending. If not, if one company or one industry decides to up its price, and just for simplicity, let's suppose that all consumers continue to buy that good or service, those consumers then have less money available to spend on other goods and services, so it pushes demand down elsewhere, and those prices will fall. The only way you get a sustained inflation, as we've seen, is if ultimately the amount of money in circulation and being spent has gone up. So, greedflation, there's certainly been periods in this pandemic where both profit margins and prices have gone up at the same time. I think that was driven by the fact that retail prices are often more flexible than firms' wage costs. But that can't explain, that has very little explanatory power for what we've seen in terms of the trends in inflation. And, in many of these sectors, as you say, the price of eggs went up dramatically, but has come down dramatically again. So was that a fact that the egg producers were suddenly getting less greedy, or the retailers were getting less greedy? This makes no sense.
This point you're making about collusion, I think, is one that it behooves us as members of the Adam Smith fan club to make this point, because the left always loves to cite this passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations where he says, and I talk about this a lot on here, but rarely will men of the same industry or trade gather where the conversation doesn't quickly turn to a conspiracy against the public good, right? That's the collusion case. That's what Elizabeth Warren says supermarkets are doing. What they always leave out is the next paragraph, where he says basically that won't matter so long as the state stays out of it, right? Because as your point is, the incentives for someone to undercut all the other supermarkets by keeping their prices low is so great that these conspiracies are very hard to sustain. I do think there are some examples of like local state car dealership systems that are pretty gross and conspiratorial, but we can get to that if you want. But like with supermarket chains, it's just, if everybody agrees to hike their prices 20% and you say psych and you keep them, flat or even lower them, you're just going to get all their customers. And so like it's very difficult to sustain those conspiracies in a competitive market unless the state steps in and puts its finger on the scale and says, and gives special privileges or codifies or ratifies in some way that conspiracy to create barriers to entry for competition. And that's, I think, the only really sustained monopolies are ones where the government is involved and says we need to keep this a monopoly. And that is the thing that I think the left gets wrong in their understanding about all this, is that just left to their own devices, capitalist conspiracies, or even monopolies, they can exist from time to time. But Schumpeter talks about how once you get a monopoly, as long as it's not protected by government, the incentives for smaller innovators to sort of go after its market becomes huger and huger and huger. And that's what creative destruction is, right? And this point is sort of left out, is that the essence of having accurate prices is the way you have real competition.
Yeah, no, over time, I used to be a bit of a squish on like antitrust and competition law. And over time, I've become more libertarian on it for precisely this reason. Because if you look historically, even the businesses that were assumed to have overwhelming dominance in industries, companies like Kodak, IBM, or whatever, new upstarts have come along and completely disrupted them. Right. Whether it be the digital camera and then the mobile phone that can take the smartphones that can take pictures. But you raise a really interesting point, which is about how collusion is made possible only really on a sustainable basis if the state's involved. Because one of the great ironies here is that politicians like Elizabeth Warren want to introduce a kind of federal anti-price gouging act, which would have in effect capped many prices that we saw going up during the pandemic. And one of the things she wants to do as part of that act is get a lot of major corporations to submit SEC filings every year outlining tons of details about their costs, their input costs, their wage costs, their specific prices, their margins. And that is a recipe for price collusion among genuinely more oligopolistic markets, for want of a better term. So ironically, with this push for kind of transparency and all this and all this kind of fear that we have around this idea of greedflation, if they were to introduce a piece of legislation like that, the opportunity to actually engage in price coordination would be that much greater as a result of any company in that industry being able to see this detailed, extensive information about what other companies were doing.
Right, and it's also, it's also a recipe for oligopoly in another reason, because the compliance costs with providing that kind of information are a barrier to entry for smaller firms, right? The more, this is, I told people to take out their bingo cards, but like, complexity is a subsidy, right? And so it's, it's rare I quote a lot of Marxist historians, but Gabriel Kolko kind of got all of this stuff right when he talked about how, big business, the whole progressive muckraking narrative about how it was big business versus government in the progressive era is just completely, I don't want to say completely wrong, largely demonstrably wrong, right? Big business wanted to be regulated. It wanted to get its fingers into government because that's what, when the government hugs you, you get to hug it back. And so U.S. Steel wanted to be regulated because they basically wanted to be sort of a monopoly state steel utility in effect, right? And the phone companies too, they wanted the state to get out of it, to push out its, their competitors. And because the left is right about the way a lot of businessmen think. Businessmen want to, they want to take what Albert J. Nock would call Epstein's law, which is just sort of the shortest distance to whatever their desired goal is. And so they're very much, for fair competition for thee, but protectionism for me. And so the weird thing is that the state keeps trying to give them, these companies, what they want and lock out competition, when the only place for the state to get involved in this stuff is to ensure really aggressive, the possibility of real competition. And even then it's a judgment call, because usually there's some sort of special pleading going on. But like, what's his face, Zuckerberg, at Facebook, he begged Congress, regulate social media, regulate Facebook, because he has the resources and the wherewithal and the lawyers and the compliance people and the programmers to be able to afford whatever regulations they throw on social media platforms, but it's going to keep any competing social media platform from competing with them. And that is the collusion thing that I'm now sort of seeing on left and right, is it's because there's a certain logic of, we got to get our people at the table and create systems that seem like we're ensuring fairness and fair and all these other things. But in reality, it's corporatism. It's mutual back scratching and screwing the little guy, because when you get rid of innovation, you're screwing the little guy.
Yeah, and even in Europe, where they've got this new Digital Markets Act, which is supposed to curb the market power of big tech companies from the United States, they introduced a lot of this anti-self-preferencing legislation. So now, like, if you go onto Google in Europe, parts of the EU, and you search for a place, it doesn't automatically come up with a Google map of where that place is, because that's seen as a self-preference for Google, preferencing its own map services over other app services. So all these companies have had to adjust to these regulations. But now a lot of the complainants, the people who wanted these regulations in place, competitors like Yelp and the like, are saying, well, actually, Google have complied in a way where it's not really helping us much. Our business isn't really going up. And so rather than just seeing it as a regulation to level the playing field, in fact, what the politicians and regulators and bureaucrats are now doing is, in essence, saying the fact that these companies aren't doing better, even though Google have changed these practices, is evidence that there's some sort of anti-competitive behavior going on. So it becomes like a tautology, right? Unless you design the market in a way that bureaucrats assume reflects competition, then what's happening is anti-competitive. And that's the direction that they're going down in Europe with this type of regulation. I think we'd be in danger of going down if if kind of Lena Khan and the FTC have free reign on this stuff.
All right, so if you have a better example, go with that. But like, it seems to me there can't be that many topics more studied and more provably bad economics than rent control. And yet, and I'll be the first to admit I benefited from rent control. It was rent stabilization, but same thing. In New York City in the 1970s and 1980s, we lived in a rent stabilized apartment. My dad, completely against the policy, but he was like, who do you want me to write the fair market value check to? And yet it endures. So, just sort of explain why rent control doesn't work and why it has all of these unintended consequences.
Well, there are a lot of different types of rent control, but I mean, the broad story is that in hot housing markets, so usually cities that are growing very, very quickly, demand for housing is going up, and in many places there are kind of supply constraints. We have zoning laws, land use planning laws, and the like. So you tend to get periods in which rents go up pretty quickly, and the demand then is for politicians to step in effect hold the increase in rents below what that increase would have been under a free market. Now, that has one obvious consequence. Holding the rent below the market rate increases the amount of demand, the quantity of housing demanded, because people look at it and say, wow, housing is cheaper as a result of below market rents. I really want to get in on that. But at the same time, of course, it becomes less profitable for landlords to rent, at least if they're covered within that market. So they're more likely to convert their properties to perhaps condos that fall outside of the rent control regime. They're more likely to sell the property for owner occupation. They're more likely to come to some sort of arrangement with a family member who live in the property or whatever. So you get this gap between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So in effect, you have a shortage in the market. Now, in reality, a lot of the rent control regulation excludes certain types of property, say property built within the last 15 to 20 years or whatever, because it tries not to deter kind of new supply coming to the market. And when that occurs, you tend to get other means of landlords reacting to kind of mitigate their risks. So one thing that they do is they're less likely to refurbish the property, invest in kind of maintenance and upkeep. In effect, you let the price of the rental price of the property, the new rental price of the property, reflect the quality of the property by allowing the quality of the property to diminish. Another thing that tends to happen is that many people who would perhaps be better suited to live in an alternative property, or move into a new job opportunity, or moving as a result of having kids, don't do so because they don't want to lose the benefit of a rent-controlled property. So you tend to get a lot of misallocation in the sector, whereby people are living in properties not particularly well suited to them or to the broader needs of the economy. So you kind of package this all together. Then the second order consequences of that, the decline in investment in properties means property values fall. So then property tax revenues fall. That affects the quality of local governance. And there's all these sorts of distortions kind of created as a result of this policy. And unfortunately, we're seeing this re-emerge really strongly for the first time since the 1970s. 14 local governments have instituted rent control across the US since 2018. Some major states, Oregon has done a cap of 7% plus inflation for older buildings. California, a cap of 5% plus inflation. And we don't appear to have learned any of these lessons of, the most well-studied, as you say, the most well-studied price control in history. And almost all of the evidence suggests that basic economic theory, kind of the Econ 101 take on rent control, is completely right. And so it's like a profoundly depressing state of affairs, but I think reflective of the fact that many housing markets across the world, the English-speaking world mainly, are really messed up as a result of zoning and land use planning laws.
Yeah, so like this gets to that. There's this article I tried to find. I found a reference to it. So, you know, part of the problem is, as you were getting at it when we started, is once you start trying to control prices for X, it turns out that that has knock-on effects for Y and for Z and for a zillion other things, and it takes on the logic of a cancer cell, right? Where you just don't know where to stop because, you know, it's the whole system is based upon competitive prices, and when you make one price uncompetitive, that creates distortions elsewhere. And so I think a great illustration of this is, so California just passed a $20 minimum wage, and then it dawned on them, holy crap, this is accelerating the rise in self-checkout scanners at supermarkets. So now they're considering a bill to ban or limit the use of automated self-checkout, right? And you can just see it's you give a mouse a cookie kind of thing, right? It keeps going. And I personally, I don't love self-checkout. I use it a lot, but because it's cost benefit analysis in terms of my time a lot of time. But like, this is the problem, is like it's the confusion of is and ought, right? It's great if we can mandate successfully $100 an hour minimum wage with no knock-on effects, without anything. Of course we would have to do that, but it doesn't work that way, because the actual minimum wage is zero, and if you made a minimum wage of $100, it would be all robots, or it'd be no businesses at all.
Yeah, I think this whole debate on minimum wages got kind of sidelined into a bit of a cul-de-sac over the years, where we tend to think of the only two effects of minimum wages being the impact on like pay rates per hour for the worker, and the effect on kind of jobs or hours demanded from the employer. When, as you say, there are a whole rich number of margins of adjustment that firms can make other than cutting the number of jobs. So there's a great chapter in this book on that by Jeffrey Clemens, who's an academic economist. And he notes, when you have a higher minimum wage, what firms care about is their overall labor costs. So one thing that you see is that firms with when minimum wages go up, firms are less likely to have employer-provided health insurance, for example. So they kind of cut another benefit, which is not, the direct wage costs, but a cost of employment. They tend to reduce amenities. They make less investment in physical workspace. They invest less in training. They might have tighter performance reviews of their employees. They are much firmer on how they schedule hours, and quite often move to kind of on-call work rather than having regular hours. Some of them sweat their employees harder. They take away their breaks, take away some of the perks. And so once you consider all of these things, the actual kind of welfare benefits in the broader sense of the economic sense of the term to a worker of the wage going up may be way smaller in reality than it looks on paper, even if their pay has gone up. And as you say, one of the ways that firms can adjust to this is investing in capital replacements for labor, investing in machines if the price of labor gets too high, but also just hiring higher productivity workers, less risky workers, not giving the job to somebody at an entry level who perhaps has been untested before, and you don't really know whether they're going to be good because they have a big gap on their employment history or whatever. So there are all sorts of ways that firms adjust. And, a proper, richer consideration of the impact of this as a price control needs to consider all of those margins and not just the impact on the number of jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I have a lot of problems with medieval economics, as you might imagine. But like, one of the things that they got kind of right was apprenticeships, where families would actually pay the blacksmith to take their kid off their hands, right? Because if you're paying some kid zero, some unskilled kid no money, you're much more tolerant of their mistakes than if you're paying them $20 an hour, right? And one of the
Mm-hmm.
one of the benefits of entry-level jobs is you learn a whole set of skills. Um, the the 1980s rhetoric, which you're probably too young to remember, about burger flipping jobs not being good jobs. It's like, if you work at McDonald's for 6 months where you show up on time and you learn to be courteous and work well with others and have a good work ethic, you'll be an assistant manager within 6 months. You'll be running a franchise within 18 months or 2 years if you're good. I mean, like, these are they these entry level jobs teach skills that are lifetime values for people. And anybody who knows anybody in retail knows that just the kid who shows up on time and has a good attitude about the work does not stay at a low level. And the problem with a lot of the minimum wage stuff, I'm a little conflicted because there are clearly some people who are skills locked. They're going to be in these jobs forever, and that makes me sad. But, like, at the same time, the problem with this minimum wage stuff is you want to set the price low enough for a minimum wage so that there's an incentive for employers to take risks on people. That's how you have a dynamic economy and a dynamic job market. And instead, if you're going to make me, if they passed the law that said at the dispatch we have to pay every right out of college scribbler, pay them $250,000 a year, I'm going to look long and hard for who that scribbler is, right? I'm going to find, like, the smartest, weirdest, most skilled kid right out of school possible. But if we're paying them, entry level, good, but entry level for journalism wages, you're willing to take more of a flyer. And I think that refusal to acknowledge the dynamism of how people start their lives with work is kind of tragic.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it's actually an understated potential cause. One of my theories is that one of the reasons you've seen an increase in non-competes in some of these low-skilled industries, should we call them, like fast food, is precisely because minimum wages have been going up aggressively in different states. So, if you're somebody at a fast food franchise and you're giving one of those individuals their first start in the job market, and for the first 3 or 4 weeks they're going to be useless at their job, they're going to take some training, it's going to take time to get them up to speed, you want to make sure that they're going to stay with you and they're kind of locked into that employment for a while so that you get the benefits of the training, right, and the risk that you're taking on them. So actually there's some economic evidence to suggest that one of the reasons a lot of these companies might be using non-competes is because as minimum wages have gone up, it's become more risky to take these people on. So actually once they're on, you don't want them to then move to another franchisee or move from McDonald's to Burger King or move to a kind of competitor. So we have to, you have to be very careful about some of the second order consequences of price and wage controls, because a lot of the time firms are innovative and they'll find other ways to try and mitigate their risks. And some of those might be not just more harmful to the broader economy, but more harmful to the individual workers' prospects themselves.
So one of the problems with talking to libertarians, and I have a lifetime of experience with this, is you ask them, okay, so what should we do? And they get very Hippocratic, Hippocratic very quickly. And then you're just like, just do no harm, right? Just get out of this stuff and let markets figure it out. And I'm not saying you're anarchists. I'm not saying, like, you don't believe that there are certain minimal health and safety standards and OSHA and all these kinds of things. But basically that's sort of the argument is, don't try to outthink the market, let the market function. Are there, which I'm 100% sympathetic with, right? Don't get me wrong. It one of the fun things about talking to left-wingers is when you ask them, so what would you do to fix this? They at least come up with all sorts of quirky, adorable, bless your heart, dumbass ideas. But like, and now you're getting them the same thing from the sort of the populist right. But are there practical sort of baby steps things that you think the government should be doing in a sort of a more concrete way Or are there what are the things that they're doing badly right now that are the lowest hanging fruit that you think you could actually persuade people on Capitol Hill or whatever to stop doing the bad things?
In regard to low pay, or more generally?
Well, I mean, it's sort of in general, like in places where the government is screwing up, where is distorting the proper functioning of prices. So, housing policy, right? I mean, the problem is there's not a lot for Congress to do because so much of housing policy is a state or local thing. The federal minimum wage area. You mentioned Lena Khan, and I heard a sulfur nostril stallion whinny in the background. Whenever her name is mentioned. Uh, what are the areas where, if you could, let's put it this way, you have someone on cop, this book is something of a monkey paw, and you can give it to somebody on Capitol Hill, and they take away from it at least one lesson that they can apply. What are the lessons you think that they should apply to actual public policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a hell of a lot of price controls are introduced in the name of protecting or helping the poor, right? Not just minimum wages, but rent control, as you discussed, but also interest rate caps and everything else. So what would I do to help the poor? Well, going a bit Hippocratic, I think first you do need to do no harm, and that means I've talked about this to Congress, to the Joint Economic Committee. I think that an agenda to try and lower living costs through supply side deregulation, through opening up markets in a range of areas, could be really quite powerful. I think we've hit diminishing returns on redistribution. I think the kind of war on poverty did reduce poverty to a certain extent, but we've kind of hit diminishing returns on that. And I think a lot of the problems where we see big distortions of prices and markets not only raise living costs for the poor, but also reduce their job mobility and all sorts of other second-order consequences that are actually harmful to some of the poorest people in the country. So I think that the most important thing that we could do is land use and zoning reform. As you say, that's at a local level mainly, but maybe some state preemption on certain things in regards to that. I think in particular areas like childcare regulation, I think there should be an overt effort to try and row back on some of the way that that's been made a more kind of educational establishment over the years, and make it a bit of a return to an open, pluralistic market that just provides people with caring for their kids when they need to care for their kids. Stripping back some of these occupational licensing requirements for things like that. I think it's very difficult to justify extensive protectionism in areas like food and clothing when they are so disproportionately, the cost is so disproportionately borne by the poorest in society. The US tariff schedule is incredibly regressive, as progressives would say. So I think if you did all of those things, you could perhaps, for certain illustrative families, get to a situation where you were saving them $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year. Now, maybe that does not go anywhere near far enough to alleviate their situation. But, beyond that, and I'm not endorsing this necessarily, but beyond that, I think if you're going to do redistribution and say, as a society, we do not accept people being this level of poverty or whatever, then you should do it honestly and transparently through the tax and benefit system, and not try to control prices to achieve the same end. Because, for any given, we know that prices tend to produce efficient outcomes. They raise the overall, free market prices tend to produce efficient outcomes. They raise the overall level of prosperity. And if you think that there are people left behind, you should honestly and transparently raise taxes from that productive activity and give it to the people that you think need their incomes raising. But I first would engage in the deregulation agenda, but if that doesn't go far enough, I'm willing to accept that there might be some role for the state in terms of the income redistribution I've outlined.
So I know we're going to wrap up, but I got a question for you. So I read somewhere, and it seemed to be true, but I haven't followed up on it. It seemed to be true in my own experience, that Uber was experimenting with basically floating prices on the peg to the ability to pay, right? So that they have some algorithm that says I'm willing to pay for Uber Comfort or Uber XL or Uber Black, whatever these things are, more than my daughter would be. And so the price quoted to me is higher than the price quoted to my daughter. And I found that to be true when I was with her in Prague last year, and I've anecdotally seen that that's true elsewhere. I'm very conflicted about this. It seems to me that this is kind of the economics of the grand bazaar being reintroduced into an efficient market system. Where like, oh, look at the deep-pocketed, stupid tourists. They'll pay 10 times for this rug what somebody who lives here in Istanbul would pay for it, kind of thing. But because it's done with algorithms, we think it's so much more sophisticated and better and all that. What do you think about it? Like philosophically, are you okay with it? Is there it's not about transparent prices anymore, right? There's something else going on there. And I generally think price gouging is a terrible concept, but when you can do it narrowcast to specific individuals, right? Where it's not like when they talk about price gouging for gas stations and they say, oh, look, the price of gas per gallon for everybody is $7 a gallon. That's price gouging. I disagree with that. That's like supply and demand stuff. But if the price I have to pay because I have more money than somebody else is higher, I've been gouged. At least that's how it kind of feels to me. And I have friends who disagree with me on this, so I'm just kind of curious, where do you come down on this?
Well, to a certain extent, it already happens, and it has already happened for a long time, right? So if you're a business, there used to be a period of time, I don't know if it's been arbitraged away or whatever, where during the week, flight prices when you were booking flight prices, they tended to be more expensive because they knew they were being booked by businesses for business travelers. Whereas at weekends, it was cheaper to book the same flights because they knew it was kind of individuals searching for an opportunity to go on vacation or whatever. So to a certain extent, you've already had that, but you're right, it's been in groups as opposed to, this price discrimination, we call it, hasn't been targeted at the individual. And I think you're also right to point out it is kind of like a return to the market-based bazaar, where you're kind of haggling over how much to pay. I think we probably will see some of this. I think to the extent consumers don't like it, those companies will be at a competitive disadvantage, and consumers' thoughts on this issue and consumers' ability and willingness to engage with these firms will obviously be a constraint here. I don't have any kind of inherent philosophical objections to it, and one reason why is that you kind of have to think this through dynamically. So let's suppose that some companies trial this and they find out as a result that their profit opportunities from this are higher than they otherwise would be. That's presumably the reason why they're doing it. We believe in a free market capitalist system that profit signal will be passed to other potential entrepreneurs, entrants to the industry. And if this is a great way of doing things, you will get entry into that sector, which will drive down the profit margin, and you'll get more competition. So the underlying market price may actually fall as a result of the entrepreneurial opportunities that this profit seeking generates. Now, does that mean that every individual customer will be better off? No. There may well be people who are very unresponsive to price who end up paying more. But I don't think we should think of it as in terms of prices automatically kind of going up for many people in regards to that. It may well be over time that sort of profit opportunity in the way that airline kind of unbundling and price discrimination has enabled lower basic fares for flights has a similar effect in many of those sectors too. I don't know if that's answered your question or you think it's a bit of a cop-out.
No, I mean, look, I obviously directionally sympathetic, right? Just let the market play with this stuff and see what happens, and don't preempt it. At the same time, it seems to me that like this could lead to lots of weird unintended consequences, where very rich people will have their janitors order their Ubers for them, right? That you'll have other people. It seems like it's going to be a golden age for ExpressVPN, right? Where you can sort of hide your identity so that you can get a more fair price. And I get your point, right? It's like supermarkets in rich neighborhoods will have higher prices conceivably than ones in the outer suburbs, right? I'm not even sure that's true, but let's just sort of, for the sake of argument, say it's true, because it turns out that actually groceries are most expensive in really poor neighborhoods, but that's a different story. But like, forget a grocery store, a sandwich shop. The sandwich shop in a ritzy high-end neighborhood is going to be, the sandwich is going to be more expensive than in some place where like local construction workers go. I have no problem with that kind of thing of gouging by demographic. And it's not really necessarily gouging, because it's more expensive rent in a high-end neighborhood. There are other costs that come with all these kinds of things. But the idea that, I guess what I don't like about it on a philosophical level is, I've spent a lot of time in my life defending prices as this information signal thing. And now we're making it much more subjective, where the price isn't necessarily signaling the factors of the supply. I am being subjected to a guess about my demand on an individual basis, and it makes me feel a little bit like a sucker. And there's something about it that it rubs me the wrong way. Now, I've sent this to a bunch of libertarian friends, including some PhD economists, and this is awesome. This is fantastic. I love it. And I kind of get why they think it's cool. I just still there's something in it I haven't fully explored that I find philosophically kind of gross about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of neutral on different pricing mechanisms. I mean, I know what you mean. There are a lot of libertarians and a lot of economists who automatically talk as if full dynamic pricing across the whole economy would be great and a boon to everybody. I don't necessarily think it's the case. I mean, I think that obtaining knowledge about the bundle of price and quality that, say, a restaurant or a sandwich shop provides is costly. And it's not necessarily always efficient for somebody to walk into a sandwich shop at lunchtime and see that the price is twice as high as normal, and then have to walk elsewhere to see what the price is somewhere else, or look on their phone and see what the price is somewhere else. Consumers often do not like doing that. So I'm kind of neutral on these types of pricing experiments. What I dislike is the fact that there are a lot of politicians here in Washington, D.C. at the moment, Joe Biden with the anti-junk fees agenda, Elizabeth Warren, who are in effect saying that they know better about how businesses should price their goods and services than the businesses trialing this stuff themselves. And, I think a lot of that agenda is incoherent. Sometimes the Biden administration says it wants everything bundled up into kind of one single price, so we have this transparency. Other times they say landlords should unbundle all of their different prices, so they shouldn't combine their internet service charges with their rents and stuff, but should let consumers see this transparently. So there's kind of no clear through line through all of this stuff. But ultimately, we need a market economy to test these experiments, to see what people like and are willing to pay for, and the businesses that do things that fulfill consumers' wants and needs will make big profits, and other businesses will rush to do the same thing. And if they do things that are really unpopular, that they'll fail. So we kind of have to let that system play out.
Yeah, I'm I guess that's my compromise position too. Is let them experiment with it, and we'll see what the market says about it. Um, and it's all right. Last thing, I know we're long, but you kind of hinted at this. You're a think tank guy. I'm a think tank guy. We're both classical liberal guys. We're both like, what has two thumbs and loves the market, this guy kind of people. And look, I know there's a long tradition of people, particularly at Cato, banging their heads against the wall about politicians not listening to them, right? Such is the life we have chosen.
I thought we were running Washington for the last 40 years, Jonah. The libertarians have been running economic policy here.
But that sort of gets at my point, right? Is like, at least it used to be that Republicans liked listening to libertarians, even if they didn't do what libertarians wanted them to do. And it feels like the Republican Party has decided that they think the mistakes made by Democrats didn't stem from any sort of fundamental problem with industrial policy or price setting or any of these things. It stemmed from the fact that they're woke and we're not. So we can set prices and we can set tariffs and we can do these things. And I mean, I know that the Libertarian Party spiraled off into la la land a long time ago, but I didn't think it could get worse, and it's gotten a lot worse lately. Particularly some of the state-based ones, which have just basically become full-blown racist, psychopathic, bizarro land things. So the question is, do you despair? Do you think we've? And again, you're talking to the guy who wrote Suicide of the West. But do you think we've turned the corner, and that the dumbest stuff is behind us, or do you think the dumbest stuff is still ahead?
Well, sometimes when you're doing this stuff, you feel a bit like Jon Snow in the Battle of the Bastards. You know that scene where he's holding up the sword, and Ramsay Bolton's cavalry is advancing towards him, and just as they're about to hit him, his own side comes charging in from behind, and it's just kind of chaos everywhere. I don't despair as such. I actually think, talking to a lot of Republicans and conservative outlets, there's an ongoing unfinished battle on what a Republican economic policy should be. Now, clearly over the last 4 or 5 years or so, the national conservatives, the likes of kind of Oren Cass and CPI and other organizations, American Compass, have been trying to redefine what conservative economics means in a direction that's more overtly protectionist, mercantilist, pro-big union labor, pro-industrial policy, pro-using the power of the state to achieve cultural ends. And that's making inroads. And there's no doubt about it. When you go up and speak to people on the Hill, there's a degree of energy there. But there are still a lot of Republican politicians who, when you get them in that quiet room, do believe this stuff. And sometimes, there's real opportunities that come from pointing out that a lot of these policies are extremely popular with progressives. Joe Biden yesterday came out and raised tariffs on a bunch of Chinese goods, for example. Now, the conservative position on China can be nuanced, and I know there's lots of different people within the party with different views, but I've been quite heartened by the fact that there are at least some people and a lot of conservative intellectuals pushing back and talking about how this is going to both raise the cost to American consumers, but also make achieving what Joe Biden says he wants to do in terms of carbon mitigation more difficult. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying I don't despair yet, because I don't think the Republican Party on economics has been fully lost. There are a lot of freedom conservatives, they call themselves. I know you're a signatory to that letter, and I think they're not an insubstantive part of the coalition. And when you actually poll Republican voters on this stuff, and you give them sample kind of quotations, advertising particular policies, they instinctively oppose lots of this stuff, other than restrictions on trade with China, which might explain why there's a degree of a stronger degree of bipartisan consensus there. But I think there's still a lot to play for in this area. And I think as some of the I think it's incumbent on us as libertarians to highlight some of the mistakes, downsides, unintended consequences, and costs of the current industrial policy moment, and show, is this really a route that Republicans want to go down, particularly given you giving all these powers over to the federal government. Democrats are going to be running this city at least half the time, and these agencies that you want to empower are going to be stuffed full of democratic sympathetic bureaucrats 100% of the time. And I think, that's an argument that we can make inroads.
Bless your heart. Anyway, I'm sorry we didn't get into the protectionist, electric car stuff. I'll just say that on the China thing, I've always thought that the argument for national security is a valid argument for some protectionist or industrial policy measures, like being able to make our own battleships is a good thing, and there are certain things that flow from that. The problem is the tendency of people to define everything they want as a national security imperative, and so where you draw the line drawing exercise can get really stupid really quickly. But
and I know this is a point that you've made before, Jonah, but it is really something when you have Joe Biden and other Democrats coming out and calling climate change an existential threat, and then in the second breath saying, but, we don't want all these cheap electric vehicles that could help us solve it. Actually, we want to protect good American jobs. I mean, is it an existential threat or not? If there was an asteroid hurtling towards the Earth, would we be debating whether we should have China participate in trying to shoot down the asteroid, for national security reasons? No, we wouldn't.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think climate change is real, but a lot of the climate change stuff is pretextual for industrial policy, right? I mean, it just sort of has been from the beginning, and which is a perfect example of the logic of national security, or crisis in Leviathan, if you want to go that way, infecting policymaking. Is like they like to use the argument about existential threat to justify economic policies that they want, and then when you say, well, the better way to deal with an existential threat are different economic policies, they say, no, we need the economic policies, right? I mean, it's like, nuclear power. The idea that Bernie Sanders is against nuclear power, I think, is just fundamentally discrediting of anything Bernie Sanders has to say about climate change, right? It just makes no sense. If you can't call climate change an extinction level event and then say, yeah, but we don't want, the only conceivable source of energy at scale that has zero climate impact, because we think it's icky, Anyway.
No, you're right. You're right about crisis, though. I mean, bringing this kind of full circle to the purpose of the book, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this turn against market prices and all of these bad ideas and misconceptions of inflation come about is because the last few years have been tough for a lot of people. Grocery prices up 21% since Joe Biden became president, having only gone up 18% in the previous 11 years. New mortgage costs now 7.1% average, highest they've been since 2001. The American people, a lot of them extremely angry with this stuff. And so politicians, central bankers have huge incentives to point to apparently malevolent actors or external forces to excuse themselves from some of the macroeconomic mistakes that they've made. So when you get big crises and you get big public turns, there's a reason that often economics turns populist.
And with that, we'll leave it there. Ryan Bourne, thank you so much for doing this. Great to have you on. The book, again, is The War on Prices: How Popular Misconceptions About Inflation, Prices, and Value Create Bad Policy. Thanks again for being on the Remnant.
Thank you, Jonah.